I'm going to introduce the first speaker we're going to hear from, and later Kristen will introduce our second. We're so thrilled. We were really happy when Dr. Iva Carruthers agreed to be with us this weekend. Dr. Carruthers is a daughter of Chicago. She's been very devoted to her hometown. She is a sociologist, a theologian. She's an entrepreneur, a mother and grandmother. She is the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, which is an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition. It is a 501c3, and it now has status with the United Nations as an NGO. SDPC, as you can see in your program, is a unique, influential, and esteemed network of faith-based advocates and activists, clergy, and lay. Dr. Carruthers serves on a number of boards. Her leadership is requested by a number of organizations, including our partner group here for EAD, Bread for the World. She is a prolific writer and editor, and she is also we have lots of theologians who come and speak at EAD. I'm not quite sure we've ever had a theologian who's also on the White House Advisory Council on the internet. So that's a new one for us, so we're very pleased to be breaking that line here. So she's won numerous awards. She has been the 2000 Woman Entrepreneur of the Year for Northeastern Illinois University. She was 2001 Outstanding Mother Award for Ebony Magazine, and many, many others. We're just thrilled to have her with us. We know it's going to be a pretty intense and thought-provoking, challenging time. So please help us welcome Dr. Iva Carruthers.
Good morning. It's a wonderful morning. It's sunny in Chicago. We love this kind of weather. And God is good and gracious to allow me to experience it with you this morning. For that, I am truly grateful. Okay. Excuse me while I get... I had forgotten about that internet piece. That was really when the internet first got started. I was an entrepreneur in software development, and I got engaged in instructional technology. Let me begin by just saying to you that this has really been a very challenging and a painful reflection to prepare. And so I did have a lot of anxiety, and God and I had a lot of conversations about this because as the days, as you can imagine, got closer and closer to this actual event, my mind, body, and spirit, and perhaps yours, had to absorb and contemplate the incredible, dreadful, and astounding reruns of police shootings of African American men from one end of this country to another. And we also know there are many stories which are untold that never make the national news, including the one most recently revealed in Chicago, where Chicago has now agreed to reparations for a police shooting of a child in the back 16 times. And the Justice Department is now investigating. So my first disclaimer to you is that I stand here before you as an African American mother of 2 sons, forced to interpret the signs of these times. But clearly, I am most pleased and called in this reflection as a reflection of ministry, and that is what brings me to this place and to this space to speak a word. I speak to you on the assumption that God has indeed set all of us apart, otherwise we would not be here. In fact, I'm willing to say that you think you chose to be here. I think God selected you to come here, and you were willing to answer the call. And that makes you very special in my heart and in my feeling for the engagement of this important conversation. I also want to let you know that I really had a rough time getting here. I actually had 3 tickets. My first plane was canceled, and then they tried to put me on another one, which started talking about equipment issues and challenges. So I went to another airline, to another terminal, and got a ticket, and I was in here at 1 o'clock this morning. So I really did want to be with you. I am certainly delighted to be sandwiched in between my two colleagues. I know that Reverend Tracy Blackman tore it up last night. That is my sister-daughter. And Bill Mefford and I go way back, and I am just so pleased and honored to work on a daily basis, getting emails from Bill giving me my next instructions as to what I must do. On Monday of this week, though, one of the greatest preachers, theologians, and prophets of the Christian church was buried. That was the Reverend Dr. Gardner C. Taylor. He was 96 years old. He was called the Prince of Preachers, the Dean of Preachers, and the beloved patriarch of the Black church. He had served as one of the closest confidants and advisors of Dr. Martin Luther King, and together they founded the Progressive National Baptist Convention. I was moved and blessed to have been able to retrieve some footings of his prophetic words during the early years of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference as a way of tribute. And I want to yield a few moments of my time to gift to you his prophetic words, which are so appropriate to our theme.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you. I take it that that was a salute to antiquity. And on their behalf, I accept it. Seriously, I salute all of those who have had to do with not just memorializing and perpetuating, but saluting the great life of Samuel Proctor. Our country has produced no one who has enjoyed so many places which really could have been considered the climactic posts of a life, as did Samuel Proctor. And in almost all of them, except one, he honored the place more than it honored him. My regard for the church would make the exception of the Abyssinian church. It honored him more than he honored it. But every other place, he honored the place more than it honored him. And coming to Atlanta is always, to me, a moving experience. Here, the first family of the America to be resides. I am perhaps the last of those who would have addressed Dr. King Jr. and Dr. King Sr. both as Mike, and his mother as Albertha. And I am moved in coming here whenever I do. And I salute these honorees who appropriately distinguished, and each one distinctly distinguished. And I am pleased to come among you. It was Abraham Heschel in his time, taught up at on the heights where my friend Dr. Cohn teaches and others, who used to say that every hour is loaded with peril and possibility, because there is no moment not charged with the divine. And so it is, as we gather here today, in this magnificent gathering of so many brightly distinguished people. It is not often recognized, I'm afraid, but our nation is at a perilous moment. Its greatest peril does not occur on the sands between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Our greatest peril occurs in the fruited plains, in the mountains, rivers, between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. It is not the problem of our adventure in Iraq. It is derivative. Our central problem is the problem which has plagued every nation which has come to preeminence in history. The centuries do not know a single instance of a nation who has come to the supremacy of power and has been spared or has spared itself the fatal sin of hubris and pride. This is the central problem. Who will speak to the nation? The so-called Christian right, which may be neither, hides its agenda under high-sounding terms like I've mentioned, abortion and homosexuality. Who will speak to the nation? It may be only left, the only possible resource the nation has, maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe, black religionists. Not by virtue of color, but by virtue of the fact that a marginalized and disregarded and disallowed community may be the only community equipped to speak objectively to a society of which it has not been allowed to be an integral part. And that is debating the virtue of blackness. Not just color, but previous condition of servitude. When I came along, our black leaders were wrestling with the matter of theodicy of God's dealing with man, and why were we in this country? Well, we may be in this country now to save it, if we will. If we have not been sufficiently drafted into this materialism. In that book which Sam Proctor honored me in allowing me to be a part, I'm going to read to you a paragraph. Contemporary American culture can be fairly categorized as sensate, hedonistic, secular, and godless. Sadly, the church and church leadership have made peace with this materialistic emphasis. We have mimicked the corporate culture and the consumer ethos with a blind servitude, and we have behaved in ways alien to the spirit of the Lord Christ. We look more like disciples of Charles Darwin than of Jesus of Nazareth. The price we have paid for this era as ministers is that when we invite others to join us in search of God, too often they have trouble taking us seriously because they have not recognized in us a hunger and a thirst for God. They see us rather succumbing to an easy conformity, emulating a greedy, narcissistic, hedonistic culture and its idolatrous lifestyle. And so Sam Proctor speaks to us from his time in history about our moment in existence. And I revel in the fact that he considered me a friend. And I live in the confident expectation that I have not seen the last of Samuel Proctor, nor has he of me.
Yes. So, Dr. Taylor, as only Dr. Taylor could have done with God's divine plan, died on Easter Sunday. Yeah. So we know that he has received his eternal just reward, and we thank him for his life and legacy. But as I was preparing for this, I discovered that, and I said, I have to give this to this body because you really do represent those who have been called and chosen to do special work in this nation. And so my reflection is entitled, If We Will. I might not ever get this way again, so I am not going to squander this opportunity, and I have too many persons of respect and mentors and friends and colleagues in the audience to do so. And God has sent me to share some insights to you about mass incarceration and the quest for global peace and justice. I was asked to talk about that in terms of ethics and policy. Like any journey, our shared journey requires a roadmap, and I will make a modest attempt to do a couple of things. One is to highlight our past ethical history based on what Dr. Taylor talked about in terms of peril and an ethic of entitlement. And two, I want to put forth an alternative ethic, again, God at work, because I've chosen the ethic of Ubuntu, which is a South African construct, and we just sang in the memory and context of that. Number three, I want to identify possible landmines or temptations at the crossroads on this journey. And four, I want to frame our call in a way that affirms the global ecumenical opportunities of convergence and collaboration as we think about global peace and justice. Unfortunately, I am not able to announce this as a message to be enjoyed, nor do I come as a messenger in search of a comfortable seat at any table. My words are cautionary. They may cut like the sword of God, but know that I offer them in love and in faith. I come this morning more in the witness protestation spirit of Mordecai than the witness passivity spirit of Esther, who eventually was cajoled to stand up for right. I trust that my comments will serve to further guide the theological and the epistemological paradigm shift that the strategic planning and systemic policy targets and approaches that we're engaged in will take in terms of essential steps to dismantling mass incarceration. But most importantly, I trust that my comments will serve in this moment in God's time to help us create and to receive a new way of being, a new world order that is seemingly being seeded, nurtured, and unearthed by a dynamic divine force. The convergence of these movements confronting the acts, the legacies, and the consequences of centuries-old systems of human exploitation and injustice here in the U.S. and around the world. I hope when we leave here, we will all have the true spirit of Esther. If I perish, I perish. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King predicted that America would have to choose between a life and victory by means of a values revolution or death and destruction by means of a poisoned soul. He went on to say that a true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out of no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, this is not just. It will look at our alliances with landed gentry of Latin America and say, this is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. The late Vincent Harding, who was a speechwriter for Dr. King, often talked about the fact that the I Have a Dream speech embalmed the real message and instructions of America and to America by this great prophet. And so in this present age of 99% versus 1%, we're in the wealthiest country in the world. We see the gap between the rich and the poor getting larger. King's words are prophetically haunting as those who were the greatest beneficiaries of that wealth disparity create alternative definitions and incentives and systems of punishment for crimes that hardly ever include them or their children. And so Dr. King is often remembered for having a dream and not remembered for the fact that he died helping the least of these, the garbage workers. And now we live and we have inherited a challenge where the new black is orange, as they say on Prime TV. And we have forgotten that the award-winning Selma movie was entertaining and informative. And I'm not sure it reminded us that the initials of SCLC and the motto of SCLC was really to save the soul of America. When, in fact, Truman, who was retired and wrote a letter telling Dr. King that he was concerned about the movement, Dr. King reminded the president of that. So this system of entitlement, including what I would call the European period of enlightenment, was a system which birthed the racialized hatred and hierarchy in the form of genocide against Native peoples and economic prosperity development off the backs of a slaveocracy and multi-generational enslavement of African people. It was a system of unbridled, violent, manifest destiny and plantation direct control. As systems of direct control go and colonialism go, and as they began to be defeated, Euro-American academicians began to craft ideologies of change to not just protect America, but to sustain the positioning and control of America, of the world, in the midst of a more economically and culturally competitive environment. Efforts at maintaining the ethic of entitlement and racial hierarchy in the midst of a dynamic, changing world in the last half of the 20th century is really, really key to our understanding of mass incarceration and systems of exploitation today. And I say that because many in the academy and public policy tables realize that the resolution of the Black Voting Rights Bill not only signaled a new world order for blacks, but could become an internal barometer of America's global hegemony over other peoples of the world who were also wrestling with freeing themselves from colonialism. In other words, during this dynamic period of an increasing globalized society, the civil rights movement had intended and unintended, latent and manifest consequences, not merely changing America, but in fact changing the world. And the response was to reframe and readjust the operative ethic and value system to which we are still wedded today. So while the civil rights movement was focused on justice to transform the system, others were focusing on adjustments to sustain the system. And I need to highlight a few markers of these major adjustments for you to really understand foundationally where mass incarceration came from. The University of Chicago Adlai Stevenson's Institute for International Affairs, I was a co-fellow as my first postdoctorate with the president of the World Bank and, for example, the former British governor of Jamaica and Rhodesia. I was able to advantage the arrogance of those persons who saw a black female of small stature as a harmless or complicit witness to their interlocking strategic planning. And I was able to do so because my grandmother had taught me very well. Sometimes it's better to sit there and be thought a fool than to express what you really want to say and then blow your cover. And so learn how to listen and listen well and know when not to speak. So moving along then. So in that posture, I began to learn very early in my career a couple of things. And I just want to run down some of these bookmarks or landmines. Ed Shields, Professor Emeritus, University of Chicago, set a framework for talking about interlocking flow of scholarship and how to create these scholarship intellectual cliques. They're now called think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation and ALEC, and many others. including super PACs. And he talked about these think tanks, or what he called isolated cliques of scholars doing the work to create the kind of policy and practices that can sustain a nation for years. S. Scott Reed, who was my co-fellow, president of the World Bank, worked on his research to craft a policy between what he called a gulf between the rich northern whites and the colored southern poor. He predicted, welcomed, and was planning for the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1972, 17 years before the actual fall, based on his understanding of the tensions that were going to happen. In terms of Western hegemony, understanding the geopolitical consequences of a shifting demographic world, B.F. Skinner redacted his history of behavioralism, the father of behavioralism, Harvard professor, and said America was going to have to abandon and understand that democracy was obsolete and that there needed to be a system called what, quote, I'm using his words, a genetic meritocracy. And he talked about a master species. In terms of laws of survival at any cost, Ben Wattenberg, advisor to 5 presidents, issued in his Birth Dearth, What Happens When People in Free Countries Don't Have Enough Babies, said that we had to, at all costs, create a situation for Western nations to continue to be prosperous because of this question. Will our values continue to dominate in a world where our population shrinks to 9%, 5%, and even lower? Our economic and military power go down. This view should not be seen as simply Western chauvinism. And so he suggested that women ought to be incented to have babies. Milton Friedman laid the groundwork for the Walmartization of the global economy, and arguing that corporate officials would only undermine a free market economy if they were to dare express socially responsible investment. He said, and I quote, "Few trends could so thoroughly undermine the very foundations of our free society as the acceptance by corporate officials of a socially responsibility other than to make as much money as possible for their stakeholders." And you add to this that Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State during the same period, was talking about the internationalization of natural resources, and you can see that we have set the precedents for preemptive strikes in Iraq. So all of these arguments and developments of theory were taking place as the Human Genome Project was unfolding, a 21st century global cultural and racial divide exacerbated by the chains of poverty, greed, media, and messaging, oligarchies, and the emergence of a global citizen aristocracy which few could and would enter. But don't forget the church. And just as church theology affirmed the ethic of entitlement during the period of the Western and European expansion, native extermination, and slave trade, missional colonialism, structural engagement, constructive engagement, an attendant theology emerged during this period. It was called kingdom or dominion theology. And one of its major proponents, the late Bishop Earl Polk, said, "Kingdom theology is a whole new theology. What we're doing is setting up a network by which we can spread propaganda so that the systems of the world will collapse because of their inability to survive, and what will be left will be a system the church has built, a Christian culture that will have dominion over the world, with the goal to represent and save the poor and oppressed, and to save the world from what they determine to be the sins of ecumenical and interfaith engagement." In other words, we're engaging in sin up in here. They define that as strategies of sin-sick souls and Satan. And that therefore justified, once again, divine preemptive strikes over recognition of state sovereignty. So these intellectual tributaries linked and led to a popularized kingdom theology that elevated Pat Robertson, who then, in terms of public policy, was over the distribution of food, for example, during the crisis of Katrina. And we can go on to talk about diamonds in Africa and the extraction of them in relationship to the church. And now with that kind of fast forward backdrop of that ethic of entitlement framework, old and new, I think I can more fully introduce mass incarceration and systems of exploitation for the policies that emanated from this collective interdisciplinary paradigm shift and brain trust. Why? Because it included a framework for mass incarceration that emanated directly from the White House. In response to the potential of the civil rights movement, President Nixon said, and I quote, "You have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to," end quote. The war on drugs was thus rhetorically cast and ushered in by this analysis by President Nixon, and it was President Reagan who turned that rhetorical war into a literal one. A couple of years after Reagan's drug war was announced, crack cocaine hit the streets of inner city communities. Under the Reagan administration, Congress and state legislators nationwide devoted millions of dollars to this drug war, passed harsh and desperate mandatory minimal sentences for drug crimes, sentences longer than murderers receive in many countries. The tough on crime stance, not reparatory justice, became the benchmark and the trophy for politicians, local and national. The hopes, the aspirations, and the efforts of the civil rights movement to transform the nation were marginalized, and ultimately they were desecrated and decimated. So, in 2015, we're looking around once again having to discuss voting rights and voting protection and poll taxes. What a shame. We're having to confront the fact that at this point in time, we now have an increased number of lynchings occurring of black bodies. So policies and programs that flowed from this new ethic of entitlement, including the Nixon-Reagan war on drugs and mass incarceration, only furthered the poison of the soul of America to which King referred. So in the 40-plus years, the U.S. has spent over $1 trillion fighting this war on drugs, arrested 45 million persons with very little results other than driving up incarceration rates. So now we can talk about mass incarceration. I'm sure most of you have read or certainly have been impacted by the work of Michelle Alexander, her benchmark book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color Blindness. If you've not read it, I would suggest you do so. She argues that, quote, since the nation's founding, African Americans repeatedly have been controlled through institutions such as slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die, but then they are reborn in new form, tailored to the needs and constraints of the time. Mass incarceration is not, as many argue, a symptom of poverty or poor chances, but rather it is evidence of a new racial caste system at work. So there are two conclusions to be drawn from her powerful book that are of particular value today. One is that mass incarceration is a symptom of systemic racism and population control that is going to require more than prison reform. Secondly, color blindness is a myth that perpetuates systemic racism, and we have got to have the courage to address that. I, like many others, stand firm on the charge that America must set a course for genuine transformation of its value system that does not demonize and dehumanize people of African descent and other people of color, one that reflects by word and deed an adherence to principles of universal human rights. Until then, America will remain, all of America, a nation in chains, whether by measures of mass incarceration or by virtue of a poisoned soul on lockdown from within. If we were to look at some of the data, we would find that the U.S. incarcerates 25% of all prisoners of the world and is only 5% of the world's population. 13% of the U.S. population is African American, but almost 50% of those in prison are black. 1/3 of black men between the ages of 18 and 28 are in prisons, jails, or on parole, waiting for their day in court. Blacks use drugs at a rate equal to others, yet they are 45% of those in prisons for drug violations. The CCA, the #1 private prison company, booked $1.7 billion in revenue 4 years ago. I could go on and on with data, and certainly we've got a substantial amount of excellent data in our packets. But the data helps convey the message, but paradoxically, the data is not the message. Mass incarceration is more than a set of data points that characterize who is in and out of prisons. It also characterizes who is labeled felon. 30 to 40% of African American males carry the label felon for crimes including non-payment of child support in a protracted environment of joblessness. My Native American sister taught me that. On the reserves, it's not unemployment, it is joblessness. Think about that distinction. And others who are on their way to prison by virtue of a failed education system and the prison to school feeding system. Mass incarceration characterizes families and communities who represent its collateral damage and large-scale impact. And so all of the consequences, social, psycho-economic, geopolitical, institutional, and personal, are embedded in this consequence of an ethic of entitlement, which has not only been foundational and endemic to Euro-American culture and prosperity and history, but have been reconstituted in the context of a global village. And that's the link to other exploitations. So in sum, I'm saying that mass incarceration is a system that has only furthered the poisoning of the soul to which King referred. And when poison enters the system and begins to take residency within the body, you know what happens. So it must either be extracted or the consequences over time is utterly destructive of the essential organs and the cells of the living organism. We have inherited the consequences of unattended poison that has resided in America's DNA across multiple generations. There have been efforts and incremental steps and progress to mitigate the poison with varying degrees of success at pain management. Two of those that I can think about are embedded in what we call the periods of Reconstruction, post-Civil War, and then the Civil Rights Movement. However, we cannot forget that the period of Reconstruction was short-lived, and it yielded back to what was called the period of Restoration. Restoration to, quote, white civility, end quote. The period of Civil Rights yielded back to the let's get tough on crime and destruction of the Great Society programs of Lyndon Baines Johnson. So now let's look at some landmines, the challenges and the temptations of the peril we confront, especially as we think beyond today to movement building in a global context. The normative value and belief system that undergirds the ethic of entitlement, the old and the new, is to deny or disaffirm the humanity of African people and prioritizes the need to control their presence in the United States. So during this same period of the Cold War politics, there was going on the unethical medical experimentation based on eugenics at Tuskegee being done by the U.S. Health Department called the syphilis study. It was in that period that President Nixon voiced his eugenics position when his colleague was expressing optimism on the progress of black people. He said, quote, "My own views is this. If you're talking about 500 years, yes, you can talk about progress. But I think it's wrong if you're talking in terms of 50 years. What has to happen is they have to be inbred. That's the only thing that's going to do it." So, fast forward to 2012, The House I Live In, award-winning documentary by Eugene Jarecki on the development and consequences of the war on drugs informs us well. This documentary makes a powerful comparison about this process of dehumanization and the 5 stages of destruction that Nazi Germany went through leading to the Holocaust and what's happening in this country as a result of the war on drugs. Jarecki noted that this process of othering as an epiphenomena of mass incarceration and similar to stages that led up to the Nazi Holocaust suggested to him that he should interview, which he did, one of the foremost authorities on the Nazi Holocaust, Richard Miller. Miller in the film identified and explained 5 stages of evolutionary cultural normalcy that allowed the Holocaust to occur. Those stages were identification, ostracism, confiscation, concentration, and annihilation. Miller's conclusion was that the United States was without question evidencing stage 4, concentration, as a result of mass incarceration. You can drill deeper to the work here of Gregory Stanton, who is over Genocide Watch, which is headquartered in DC, and you'll see his 10 stages, which are quite powerful. In any case, closer examination of these stages of human rights violations and societal genocide argue for and demonstrate the perilous times for America's, quote, multiracial democracy. Though today's normative public narrative is to marginalize or minimize racial analysis, and many argue that America is in a post-racial society for sure because we have a black president and we have Oprah. The typologies related to genocide are relevant to today's American reality in terms of mass incarceration and linked to other exploitations. And this is especially true when you then begin to move out. You look at the UN standards of human rights protocols, including treatment of prisoners, torture, solitary confinement, and the definitions of genocide and ethnic cleansing. Critical analysis, then, and a view of post-racial or colorblind society is a dangerous pretense. The denial fuels public silence and complicit endorsement of human rights violations in our backyard, undermining the moral authority of this nation on a national stage. I submit, therefore, that rather than deny the presence of racism for the centuries of theories, policies, and practices based on ethic of entitlement, racialized hierarchy, and genocide, we, the church, if no other body, we, the church, ought to be encouraging our congregations and this nation to undertake the posture and the processes that conform to truth, reparatory justice, and reconciliation. In the context of international standards of human rights, there is sufficient evidence and movement towards calling out this trajectory towards human catastrophe and genocide. If no other group will do so, the church must stand and vociferously demand oversight of sociological, educational, cultural, political, biogenetic patterns of destruction, whether intended or unintended. Such steps by the church to embrace reparatory justice and reconciliation would initiate a proactive and just approach to diminishing the possibilities and thwarting any trajectory or fulfillment of human rights violations. It would go a long way to reconstitute the value propositions that Martin Luther King talked about, the value propositions of a democracy founded off the lives of Native and African peoples. Now, some people might feel that this is hyperbole on my part and that I'm overstating the possibilities. I've already given you a disclaimer. Some are surely likely to see this as playing, quote, a race card. I don't even know what that means. But more tempered and objective assessments of the global community and the convergence of justice movements that are creating new networks or collaboration, agenda, and shared strategies would support a claim that from within and outside the U.S., there are increasingly those who have put the U.S. on human rights watch list or feel it needs to be there. More and more U.S. NGOs and activities are studying and appropriating United Nations conventions and protocols to make their case beyond the national boundaries. This past summer, Black Youth Project 100 went to Geneva and led a We Charge Genocide protest. Using the same protocols, a police commissioner who had gotten away with torture of many Chicago African-American men for years, finally imprisoned and served for 4 years. And related to that case, just this week, the city announced it had reached a more than $5 million reparations agreement for some of the men. My tax dollars, your tax dollars, and you're going to increasingly have that experience. Using similar legal arguments and pressures, the Native American community just settled a $45 million reparations case for damage done to families by the educational and child welfare system. So advocates for justice within the U.S. are linking up their movements with others to use their moral agency as a force for global transformation away from a culture of violence, racism, militarism, and materialism. And as a nation, we are at a crossroad with choices to be made. The complex issues of racial and ethnic divide, as juxtaposed with religious diversity and wealth maldistribution, is transforming the world in which we live, creating new moments of both peril and possibilities for peace. Last month, for example, I attended the UN Post-Beijing Commission on the Status of Women. There were amazing degrees of synergy and efforts at forging new alliances to create a more just, secure, equalitarian, and peaceful war for women. And youth activists from Ferguson and the United States have now visited multiple times Palestine to talk about youth activists in Palestine. It's time for us to take off of our blinders. A value system undergirded by historic Western and white entitlement and privilege, mass incarceration and privatization of prisons and privatization of water, unbridled capitalism and sexism is now intersecting, competing, and colliding with other worldviews and demographic shifts and injustices. And one can now see how racialized mass incarceration in the U.S. connects to global injustices with which we must all contend. So America's poisoned soul lockdown will only continue to weaken our position to be competitive and successful in a more competitive and ethnically diverse global environment, including the increasing experiences with homegrown, disaffected youth, some challenging why they have been denied the truth, some with the audacity and commitment to go to the UN and charge genocide, and some, for whatever reason, have just decided that they want to join ISIS. So several months ago, I, including Reverend Tracy, several people here in this room, had two unforgettable experiences with youth that underscore what I'm talking about. We were in a faith circle with leaders in Ferguson, and we heard the Eric Garner decision in New York. The young man behind me all of a sudden began to tremble. 6'2", gentle spirit, 250 pounds. I asked him, "What's the matter, honey?" And he said, "I'm fine." And I turned around again. I said, "No, you're not." He ran out of the room screaming, and these were his words: "Why do they hate and fear me? Why has God abandoned us? Where is their heart, and who is their God? This nation continues to malign and reject us. I don't even want to raise children in this nation. They have denied me the desire to even have seed of my seed." 23 years old, African-American youth. The good news is that we were able to get him a full scholarship at American Baptist College, and so he is now attending 3 months after those words. But it was Ron's words which motivated me to then call this gathering together in a retreat. And I had a white student there from Union Theological Seminary, and in the course of our engagement, he said this: "I am here because as a white seminarian with experiences in and exposure to the Moral Monday movement and activism around the Eric Garner decision, I realize more than ever how white privilege and systemic racism is destroying this nation. I feel betrayed by the silence and lies of my foreparents that I have grown up with. I feel compelled to enter into spaces like this where I am the minority, the other, and learn how to be in a community that is committed to justice for all. So our young people are speaking, and they are teaching us some things. So I trust that most in this room have some understanding of what that means, what it means to see young people, white and black, brace hashtag Black Lives Matter. They see that they are viewed as the them, where them, the victims, become the perpetrators to be feared, and us becomes the victims to be protected and secured along with our property. They understand them as them. The victim becomes the threat to privileged authority, and privileged authority becomes the delegated gatekeepers of our prisons and our souls. And if you hadn't had enough of the reruns on the killings, surely yesterday morning when we woke up and we heard that the documents show that the National Guard around Ferguson named the them as adversaries or enemies of the state, tells you a lot about where this nation is headed. Civil rights activist Ruby Sales has not only extended this work around mass incarceration in terms of looking at the community violence that comes out of police moral injury, but she's also documented more than 2,000 African-American extrajudicial or state vigilante murders since 2007, largely in the South, some including lynchings, rural, urban, along with the declared yet questionable case of suicide. Yes, Dr. Taylor, we are in peril, and the choice is ours. Nelson Mandela left us the words, "You can judge a nation by how it treats those in its jails." So I believe that hashtag Black Lives Matter is also a theological response to this nation's soul lockdown, and where do we go from here? Black Lives Matter is a theological statement on what it means to be human, and not just see me as human, but look at yourself and see your own inhumanity. So in response to this crisis, our youth are speaking, and they have embraced the mantra, "It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." So what we see evidence is that young people around the world are connecting their cries for justice because they have come to the point where they have nothing to lose but their chains. Now, I could, but I don't have time to go and do a parallel analysis of Europe. But let me just say to you that the word in Europe is securitization as the big tent idea under which immigration, terrorism, and the war on drugs has been placed. And this is the code language and public policy for fear-mongering and control of people of color as a threat to an otherwise what was a stable, homogeneous culture. And so European heads of states have organized and essentially said their vision for multiculturalism has failed. And as a result of that, they have to create new policies under this notion of securitization. In our language, it's about safety and security. Suffice it to say then that our challenge is not just policy reformation, but what we do tomorrow is very, very important. But what we need to be about is global heart transformation. We are not called to do this advocacy as mere civic engagement, but also with the vision of Caleb and Joshua and the faith of God of David, the shepherd boy who defeated Goliath. So as we consider, if we will, and choose between peril and possibilities, we must turn our attention to the next step of strategic and specific advocacy on the Hill. But let us be clear about the ultimate destination and the required commitments. The unique role of faith communities in social movement building revolves around the intersection of what people believe about their moral and spiritual agency to create change in their social condition. That is, to bring about justice. This justice can ultimately be measured by this ethic of Ubuntu, a Southern African construct of humanity. It is an ethic that is ancient, grounded in theology and justice, and highly synergistic with ecumenism and our presence here today within this ecumenical body. Archbishop Tutu defines Ubuntu as the very essence of what it means to be human. He says, quote, "My humanity is caught up, is inextricably bound up in yours. We belong in a bundle of life. I am human because I belong, I participate, I share. A person with Ubuntu is open and available to others, affirming of others, does not feel threatened that others are able and good, for he or she has a proper self-assurance that comes from knowing that he or she belongs to a greater whole and is diminished when others are humiliated or diminished, when others are tortured or oppressed, or treated as if they are less than who they are," end quote. The ethic of Ubuntu in the context of mass incarceration is simple, it's straightforward, and it's grounded in the sacred text, taking from Hebrews 13:3. Remember those who are in prison as though you were in prison with them. Those who are being tortured as though you yourselves were being tortured. So given what we know and what we have been through as a nation, it is my prayer that our journey this time around might heal ourselves from a poisoned soul and a poisoned soul lockdown. We might be able to dismantle the ethic of entitlement and embrace the ethic of Ubuntu. Ridding ourselves of a poisoned soul and lockdown compels radical integrity and faithful action. For such a time as this, we in the room represent the moral authority and the agency to work towards this ethic of Ubuntu, not just in this nation, but in the world. A poisoned soul on lockdown blocks the flow of God's Spirit within. So let us be laser focused on the ultimate goal to move beyond rational reformation by changing minds and move to soul's transformation by softening hardened hearts of the powerful. The heart is mentioned 800 times in Scripture. The heart is a site of will, wisdom, conscience, moral agency. It is the place that God deemed the response center for moral demands. A poisoned soul on lockdown unleashes irrational fear that, yes, can be measured by neural brain sciences that is framed as, quote, implicit bias. As the church, we should be cautious about an unbalanced focus on implicit bias as a substitute for racism, as advanced neurosciences to explain our predicament, rather than addressing racial hierarchy and white supremacy as a sin and shame. I offer that caution because the former takes the church off message and down a path of cheap grace, too often engaging in how to make unquestionable wrongs less than right, and even how to make what is right wrong. The church thus becomes fixated on mind reading instead of heart fixing. The church often ends up advocating for positive ways to address what the victim conveys to the mind of the fearful, over advocating against the fearful who perpetrate, sustain, and benefit from a system of victimization. There are 3 principles of action, I think, for us to consider, and then I will end. One is that we should be willing to turn over the tables in the temple as Jesus did. All leadership has a cost, and Christian leadership demands a cross, a sword of peacemaking that brings comfort to the suffering and discomfort to the comfortable. 2, we should take the lead to transfuse and transplant this nation with a serum of truth at its roots. We need truth serums that truly dismantle the myths and edifies the vision and dream for Ubuntu. A true serum that honestly engages the Native Americans and African Americans as victims of crimes against humanity in the unfolding of manifest destiny and the building of this democracy. A true serum that confronts the fear of a browning of America. We need a true serum that is the foundation of a process of confession, contrition, restoration, reparations, reconciliation, and healing. 3, we should begin the healing to transform this nation with a radical program of reparations and reconciliation with a view towards Ubuntu. My friend and colleague Katrina Brown, producer of the award-winning film Traces of a Trade, calls for a national process of restitution. Katrina, as a white seminarian, discovered that her foreparents were the largest stakeholders in the transatlantic slave trade. She is the person largely responsible for the Episcopal Church's apology for slavery. So what she has called for, and I support, is the development of a moral project of restitution that has justice and peace at its core. To be sure, we cannot and should not try to reinvent the times of the civil rights movement. Indeed, we need to frame this movement as a global human rights movement. We can hear the declarations of our youth activists and statements of interrogation of America's soul and humanity. We can see with our own eyes the actions of our youth as they seek restitution in the international courts. We are the witnesses of our own peril. We are the witnesses of our silence and complicity in the midst of a post-racial, colorblind era of mass incarceration, militarized policing, and a culture of violence. And in the end, it's not enough to attack the external reactions with a call for peace and ignore complaints of protracted justice and injustice. It's not enough to address policy reform as consequences, but ignore the causes which must be eradicated at its source. It's not enough to expand seats at the table, but demands that the fundamental table and the menu be changed. In our doing well, let us not fall into the comfort zone of an inherited cheap grace, advocating to end mass incarceration on the Hill and avoiding confronting racism and white supremacy at our dining room tables. Avoid confronting racism and white supremacy in our community meetings and indeed in our pulpits and our ministry gatherings. Within the context of this culture of collective violence, downward trajectory in today's lived experience and this crossroad before us, let us remain informed and on point for justice, knowing what awaits each of us. And what awaits each of us is the everyday choice to be or not to be a bystander. According to Irvin Stahl, bystanders are witnesses who are in a position to know about events. They are affected by difficult life conditions or other instigators. They may have learned to devalue victims and are affected by other cultural preconditions. Their passivity further changes them. It distances them from and leads them to increasingly devalue victims. It diminishes their capacity to empathize with those in distress and their sense of guilt about their inaction. In the end, they go along with and frequently even support persecution and violence. This is how he defined what happens very quietly and in a way that creeps up on communities in origins and prevention of genocide, mass killing, and collective violence. In some real sense, the church has lost its way, but we in this room represent those who remain on the right path. We have not given up our moral agency, otherwise we would not be here, and the prophetic tradition to speak truth to power. Dr. Taylor has divinely summoned us, if we will. By virtue of our engagement at Ecumenical Advocacy Days, we are making a choice to be more than a bystander as a witness and an advocate by what we do. In the end, we will not be judged by what we do here, but by what we do when we leave here, when we go back home. So I dare say we must create a movement of Ubuntu Rising, a world in which we believe and act out of principles that define my humanity by how I relate to and experience your humanity. So may we leave here in earnest quest for remembering those who are in prison as though we were in prison with them, those who are being tortured as though we ourselves are being tortured. Only then will we be able to free ourselves of the poisoned soul in lockdown. So as we consider peril and possibilities, I leave you with the words of the great theologian and activist Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who said, as he struggled with staying in the safety net of the U.S. in 1939, Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security. Weeks later, after having written those words, he was back in Germany, destined to live into his legacy as one who would accept his execution with divine grace, who would bear the cross over the comfort of a cheap grace. I don't know about you, but I do believe that this is a Kairos moment in which God is forcing a separation between the sheep from the goats. So I leave you with a stanza from one of Bonhoeffer's last writings in his poem, Stations on the Road to Freedom, as he encourages us to action. Dare to do what is just, not what fancy may call for. Lose no time with what may be, but boldly grasp what is real. The world of thought is escape. Freedom comes only through action. Step out beyond anxious waiting and into the storm of events, carried only by God's command and by your own faith. Then will freedom exultantly cry out to welcome your spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Carruthers, for helping to set the framework for why all of us are really here this weekend. And now to begin to unpack the ask, I am going to invite Dr. Bill Mefford to the stage. Dr. Mefford serves on the General Board of Church and Society of the United Methodist Church as the Director of Civil and Human Rights. He helps to build movements among United Methodists to defend the rights of immigrants, as well as to end mass incarceration. He also directs the work of the board on issues that include ending gun violence, religious freedom, and abolition of the death penalty. If that weren't enough to tell you why Dr. Mefford is an expert, the real thing you need to know that you're not going to find in his bio is that he is a fellow Cleveland Browns fan. So we know that he knows what's going on. So please welcome Dr. Mefford to the stage.
Yes, I know what suffering is. Good morning. Well, I just want to say, I really am, it's a little overwhelming. I'm very humbled to be on the stage with someone who I'm considered to be a prophet for our church, Dr. Carruthers. And whose ever idea it was to have me go after Dr. Carruthers, it was not mine. It's like having the Beatles open for Gomer Pyle. I mean, it just doesn't, something about this just doesn't work. But I want to talk really quickly, if I can, about what is going to be happening on Monday. I've been a part of the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition, which is a coalition now of over 45 faith groups here in Washington, D.C. that are working on criminal justice reform issues. I've been a part of the coalition for about 8 years. We started with about 6 groups. If you had told me back then that ending mass incarceration was going to be the theme of the 2015 EAD, I would have asked you, what is mass incarceration? Wasn't even a term back then that I knew of. Many things have changed. There's been and is tremendous energy. You are going to be part of something that I don't think has happened. Hundreds of faith advocates are going to be descending upon Capitol Hill, calling for the ending of mandatory minimum sentences. That's amazing. You're going to be called, hey, you got to clap for that. You're going to be calling for the ending of the bed quota, for the implementation of alternatives to detention. This is an incredible moment, and it is a good moment politically speaking as well. So this is a powerful time, and I am very, very excited that there's so many people here. I wish it was a little cooler in the room, but I'm excited that you're here nonetheless. So what I want to do is I want to talk real briefly about the asks and what we're going to be doing on Monday. But as with all things, what we need to realize, and I loved so much of what Dr. Carruthers shared, and especially that mass incarceration is not about the data. Now, we're going to throw out some numbers, and the numbers are horrible, and we're going to talk about those things because those things need to be talked about. But this is about people's lives. There is a context to what is happening in this country. So let me tell you the story of a man named Chris Best when we talk about mandatory minimums. Chris Best grew up in a loving household in Florida and South Carolina. His parents loved him, good home. But as we've seen with too many youth, he fell in with the wrong crowd and started using drugs. He skipped school on a number of times and was arrested. Now, truancy is a status offense. But for some reason, we incarcerate people for status offenses as youth. So he was incarcerated in a juvenile detention center several times because he was truant from school, because he was hanging out and getting high. He left high school. His addiction to using drugs grew even deeper. And in order to afford his habit, he had to sell drugs. He was caught by the police driving down the road with approximately something like 5 or 6 grams of crystal meth. In a subsequent search of his house, they found several more grams of drugs. So we're not talking about a ton of drugs, but enough. He also had a weapon. And because of his truancy arrests, because of the amount of drugs, because of the weapon, he was treated as a career criminal, and at the age of 22, over the objections of the judge who issued the sentence, the judge said at the time of his sentencing, how much he regretted having to do this. But the sentencing guidelines forced him to. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That was 2005. He was 22 years old. He has since, he's in recovery, in prison. He is a remarkable artist. His paintings are amazing. And much of the world will not get to know Chris Best or see his artistry until October of 2026. You see, this is what mandatory minimums does. It robs us of amazing people, of leaders in our communities and leaders of our families. Mandatory minimums are disproportionate to the crimes that are committed. Mandatory minimums are acontextual. It's one size fits all, which directly contradicts what Scripture calls for in justice, which is always situational and contextual. Mandatory minimums are the primary driver of what we call mass incarceration today. You'll notice in your packet there's a number, and I'm going to go ahead and hold this up. there's this sheet. I want to encourage you to read this through at least a couple times before Monday, so you can be familiar with many of the things. I'm just going to highlight some of the, just a couple of things, just to give you an idea of what exactly, how harmful mandatory minimums are. Since 1980, the population of the federal prison, the federal prison population has exploded 750%, from 25,000 people in 1980 to over 216,000 people today. The cost has gone up almost 600%. But mandatory minimums, as we've heard, are also exacerbate the racial disparities that happen within our system. In 2010, there were 10,760 mandatory minimum sentences handed down. Of that 10,760, 70% were given to African Americans and Latinos. 70%. In 2010, we saw the passage of the Fair Sentencing Act. The Fair Sentencing Act lessened the disparity between crack and powder cocaine from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1. So now we're just 1/5 as racist and unjust. Yay, America. But the thing that bill didn't do, that was a step forward. That's a step forward. The thing that bill did not do, it was not applied retroactively. So there are people who are in prison under the old 100 to 1 disparity law that everybody recognizes as unjust, who would have been let out if their sentence had been changed to 18 to 1. There are 8,800 people that are still in prison. 80%, 87% of them are African American. You see, when folks stand up here and say the U.S. criminal justice system is racist, they're not being provocative. They're not over-exaggerating. They're not coming over the top. They are speaking factually. The sky is blue. The earth is round. The U.S. criminal justice system is racist. That is a fact. And so to begin to offset this, one of the things that we are advocating for is called the Smarter Sentencing Act. The Smarter Sentencing Act, real briefly, will cut in half. Now, again, you're going to go into these offices and you're going to say, as a person of faith, I believe that mandatory minimum sentences should be done away with. I mean, the Smarter Sentencing Act, this is not our primary ask, but hey, the Smarter Sentencing Act will save the U.S. government $3 billion over the first 10 years. So when you go into the office, you could say, does your boss, if you're meeting with a staff person, if you're meeting with the member himself, say, do you believe that we should save money and stop spending so much money? And they will say, oh, my boss is a fiscal conservative. Both sides of the aisle. Then you say, good, I've got a bill for you. You could save $3 billion in 10 years. This is a bipartisan piece of legislation. In fact, I hasten to believe that for many of you, this will be the only time that you stand on the same side of the line with Senator Ted Cruz. Savor that feeling. Feel the love. Because it ain't going to last. But the Smarter Sentencing Act makes the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive. Immediately upon its passage, 8,800 people will be let out of prison. Yeah, you want to live the Jubilee? Let's get this thing passed. Second issue. Let's talk about the bed quota. Again, let's contextualize it. Let me give you a couple of quick stories. A woman from Guatemala who was pregnant and was experiencing domestic abuse at the hands of her partner. In the 8th month of her pregnancy, made the long trip to the United States. She was apprehended. She gave birth. She was handed over to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and they put her in the Berks Detention Center in Berks, Pennsylvania. Because the United States, once again, detains families. We detain families. She had to sleep in a small cell that was cold. It was called icebox in the icebox cells. So the administration officials in that detention center gave her an aluminum blanket. What? I don't even know what an aluminum blanket is. Like, why would you make a blanket out of aluminum? She left, ultimately was granted asylum. She left in just a few weeks, but she was so stressed out, she was so malnourished, that she couldn't lactate, she couldn't properly feed her baby. Let me tell you another story. Another woman with a 3-year-old son from Honduras. The father of her son repeatedly beat her and raped her, held a gun to her head in front of her son and threatened to kill her and torture her. So she fled to the United States with her son. She was picked up, she was apprehended, and she also was placed at the Berks Detention Facility in Berks, Pennsylvania. Did I mention that we detain families? There's two other centers in Texas, in Carnes, where I would like to say that the mothers in Carnes Detention Center have launched a second hunger strike. So let us pray for them. And Dilley, Texas as well. When she got to Berks, she was sexually assaulted several times by a guard. In response, the administrative officials of Berks, who came out with the famous aluminum blankets, issued instructions to the women detainees to wear looser fitting clothing. Even though Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed in 2005, there are over 140 detention centers where it has still not been implemented. What in the hell are you waiting for? Detention bed quota is lodged in the DHS appropriations bill every year and mandates that ICE fill 34,000 beds every year. At any given time, 34,000 beds must be filled. That's a good question. Why? Other than the reasons of, because somehow we enjoy putting people of color behind prison, and that this is a $2 billion expense by the government where hundreds of millions of dollars a year go into the coffers of CCA, GEO Group, and other private prison corporations. I don't know why this is done. In 2009, the ACLU, there was a family detention center in Tyler, Texas called Hutto. The conditions were so wretched, the ACLU filed a lawsuit, it was shut down, and we thought we were done with family detention. 9 months ago, the Obama administration once again started detaining families. We have to shut it down again. This thing doesn't make me mad, it pisses me off. Because there's no need for it. There's no need for it. So let's take a vote. On the second line, the second dot point says eliminate the detention bed quota for immigrants and implement alternatives to immigrant detention. Who here wants to also add in-family detention? Amen. Write it in. That's going to be one of your talking points on Monday. We want to end family detention. Because see, the problem is when folks are brought to ICE and they're seeking asylum, they're given a risk classification assessment. They're given one of 3 levels of assessment by ICE officials. 1 is release, 2 is supervised detention, 3 is detention. ICE detains everybody. even the ones that they themselves label release. See, I'm convinced that we don't need to bring a Bible to a meeting with ICE. We need to bring a dictionary, look up the word release, and see that it doesn't say to detain people. I'm not sure, this is all rooted in spiritual problems. I think we just simply have a reading problem with them. So those are the issues that we're going to be dealing with. I want to encourage you. I did a real quick flyby again to read these, to read this 4-pager, yeah, or I can't count, 4-pager. Make yourself familiar with this. I also want to call on a few folks because we have some experts in the room. I'm just going to call on a couple to have them stand up so you know who they are. When you want to know more about mass incarceration, I want to encourage you to talk to one of the smartest people in Washington, D.C. Her name is Kara Gotch. She's the Director of Advocacy for the Interfaith Criminal Justice Coalition. So, Kara, would you stand up? And she's going to be moderating a couple of the, yeah, you can clap for Kara. She's a nice person. She'll be moderating some of the panels and some of the workshops. Is Molly Gill here? No, she is not, so she does not get to be clapped for. But she's with Families Against Mandatory Minimums. They have an amazing website, FAMM.org. I urge you to check it out. There's more prisoner profiles because one of the things that we've got to do is we've got to contextualize these problems. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Also, when you talk about the immigration bed quota and ending family detention, is Mary Small here? I told them to be here. This is how powerful my word is. Yeah. She's an incredibly smart person. She's with the Detention Watch Network, and she will also be among some of the panels. So I really urge you to find Mary, who isn't small, and talk to her, because she's got amazing encyclopedic memory about all this stuff. Let me I want to, if I could, just say one last thing. We're going to have a powerful day on Monday. We're going to go advocate for these things that in this size of group have never been advocated for, and I'm excited about that. But on Tuesday, we're going to wake up, and mass incarceration is still going to be in place. And I probably shouldn't say this. I'm supposed to pump you up, but it's just not going to happen right now. Let's say we're successful with everything. We passed the Smarter Sentencing Act, which cuts in half all mandatory minimums for low-level nonviolent drug offenses. Let's say we pass the Safety Valve Act. Let's say we get rid of family detention. Amen. Let's say we get rid of the bed quota. Let's say we literally get them to read the dictionary and implement alternatives to detention. That's a good year by any standards. We will still have mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is defined by Michelle Alexander as a tightly networked collection of laws, policies, institutions, and traditions that work together to keep a group of people in a permanent status of underclass largely defined by race. It is not just simply a matter of changing a policy. We wish it was. That would be so nice. Because then us white people would get to just write letters, make phone calls, send postcards, have Bible studies, and stay nicely, safely cloistered in our white churches. Mass incarceration, one of the principal foundations, is the stigmatization that happens to people when they are incarcerated. They become isolated and detached and marginalized from the rest of society, and yes, even the rest of our churches. We have a lot of work to do on Monday, but the real work begins Tuesday. And I want to say something specifically to my white sisters and brothers. We have enormous privilege. I could put on a hoodie, I can go to the store, I can buy some iced tea and Skittles, and I know I will not get shot. I can play with a toy gun in a park, and I know I will not get shot. I can walk down the middle of the road and be a smartass, and Lord knows I have. And I will not get shot. We have enormous privilege. With that privilege comes enormous responsibility. Don't clap yet. It's going to get worse. We have not lived up to that responsibility. The onus has been on our African American brothers and sisters long enough. We are charged with the responsibility of entering into incarnational relationships with people who are directly impacted by injustice and broken systems. Incarnational relationships are not the relationships that we have out in a lobby that kind of laugh about Ted Cruz. We slap each other on the back, and then we go back to our white cloistered churches, our liberal enclaves of progressive thought. Incarnational relationships looks at the struggles, the hopes, the dreams, the pain, and it says, your struggles, your hopes, your dreams, your pain is mine. And I will share with you and walk with you, not because EAD has favored this as the subject matter for this year's conference, not because it's easy to write an email, not because it's easy to send a postcard. I will walk with you for the rest of my life. That is incarnation. That is the challenge that we have. My prayer for us is simple. I pray our advocacy changes lives. I pray that the relationships that we enter into in the coming years will transform ours. Thank you for being here.
Wow, we are really having quite a morning. Thank you very much, Dr. Mefford, Dr. Carruthers. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A. Just one quick thing. Dr. Carruthers had mentioned the film, The House I Live In, and that's one of the films shown tonight, 8:30, I think in the Potomac View Room. So, some folks have some microphones. We just have a few minutes to just take a few questions. So. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, why don't I?
Question is for what happens?
Here comes Mark with a mic.
What happens to all of those people that, if this is passed, and all those people that will be let loose? How do we take care of them? What happens to them? Like last night, what happens to the slave girl?
Are you asking us? Yes, this is what happens.
Well, I want to suggest that there are some models for what it means to create welcoming congregational communities that I think that we need to look at in terms of how we do church and what that means in terms of creating the communities that will receive people. The question is a very important one because under this notion of safety and security, we are in this false sense of safety and security thinking we can create gated communities. And there are not enough gated communities in the world to save us from what we have to contend with. And when we talk about mass incarceration, I think that's why we understand the whole nation is really in chains. And so we have got to figure out how we reconstitute based on fundamental principles that Bill has talked about in terms of reincarnational relationships, spirit of Ubuntu, the spirit of welcoming and understanding what it means to be able to carry your pain as my pain, and to be able to dismantle those ways in which we other people and other them, particularly in the church. And so it is incumbent upon us that as we go back home, we figure out how we do church differently that will allow us to be inclusive so that all people are equal under the foot of the cross.
And if I could just point out just a couple of resources, there's, I'm not sure if he's here this morning. No one I'm calling on is here this morning. But Dr. Dean Trulier leads a program called Healing Communities, which I think is an amazing model which mobilizes existing resources within congregations to meet the needs not only of those who are returning, but also the families who are supporting them. So it's a powerful resource. I think he's going to be doing a workshop. Doug Walker, who I'm sure is not here because I'm calling his name, is also going to be leading a workshop. And I know Reverend Lee Schott. Lee, would you stand up? She also leads a congregation and Women at the Well. So there's several people to talk to, and I really am glad you brought that up. Dr. Dean Trulier, and the program is called Healing Communities.
I want to know if we could get a copy of Dr. Carruthers' speech.
We'll work on it.
Yes, we'll work, yeah.
Make sure it gets on the website.
Yeah, come back to the website
by her.
after this, and those all the presentations will be on the website.
I have a question for Dr. Carruthers. I'm from Chicago, from the South Side. So I am very grateful for your history of the intellectual tributaries of knowledge. I am also a graduate of University of Chicago, but I went to school in a committee called Human Development. So I'm not part of the business school of Milton Friedman or the sociology part of Schultz. So I also like your words, poisoned soul for America. I love your metaphors. So I want to integrate mass incarceration with the issue, because I'm from the South Side, I have had that experience for 35 years of black men being stopped at the midway just for walking around. But the other issue I came here for, which I want to integrate, is sex trafficking. Because I'm from the Philippines, and I've traveled to Asia, and I know about global poverty in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia. So I want to ask you, how can we have a superplanetary issue that incorporates all this? Because we haven't talked about capitalism, but these institutions that have oppressed the developing nations, they're all in debt, and they're all not eating anything right every day. So we gotta deal with maybe the answer. I'm sure. Okay, here's my question: How can climate change be the unifying issue for the whole world, using the resources of our privileged country and the rest of Europe that started this expansion, so we can take care of the planet and the people who might survive in it?
Okay, I'm going to defer to the theological reflection that I would ground this in would be James Cone's Risk of Faith. And in that book, he connects the issue of earth care to to racism and systems of oppression, and it largely is undergirded by what I call this ethic of entitlement, as is the way in which women are marginalized and othered and exploited in the context of global exportation of American hegemony and point of view in the world order. And that's why when you connect Euro-American analysis, you will see that the post-colonial period resulted in a demographic remix where the people who had been oppressed directly through systems of colonialism, that is people of color like from India who were sent to Africa to be the middle people. Then after the fall of colonialism, at the same time that you had the emergence of the civil rights movement, those, quote, colored people came back to Europe because they wanted their passports to remain in Europe instead of going home to India. So Europe looked up and they said, we got a color problem. And that's what their issue of multiculturalism is and has grown to be. Now, Canada had enough good sense, quote, to say, don't bring me these problems. And so they were 10 years ahead of Europe in terms of putting gated policies around to drive away multiculturalism or diversity. And so what I'm saying is that this is not an American problem. It is a global problem that is driven by American hegemony.
Right, right. Take this one. Go ahead.
Dr. Carruthers, thank you for being here. I don't have very many people that I count as friends who were formerly incarcerated, even though I was formerly incarcerated. So if I wanted to, through my church, engage in conversation with, that would help lead to a strategy for helping those who were formerly incarcerated. I don't have a clue how I would do that. I could hang a flyer outside my church and say, come on in, we want to talk to you. But I don't want to use love as an excuse for boring people. I want to be able to genuinely help find a job for someone who's looking for one and wants to change his life. So, can you give me a couple of suggestions on how I can begin to engage someone who was formerly incarcerated?
I don't know what city you hail from, but I would say that one of the things that is important is to do the kind of research on your particular location and to find out if you have any people who share your values and become the kind of leadership caucus that can speak truth to power and to dare to carry the prophetic voice of your church and your moral authority to actually demand jobs from those whose corporate and political interests are the result of what happens in your community. I just left yesterday afternoon Isaiah Thomas, who is the NBA player who has committed his post-NBA play days to work with gangs and gang violence, working very closely with Father Mike Flager. In 4 years, they have taken the area of Inglewood in the city of Chicago, created a peace league in which former gang leaders are now working collaboratively together through sports. And over 90% of those men that they have worked with have now completed GEDs. 70% have now gotten jobs at the demand of the moral agency and authority of Father Mike Flager and Saint Sabina. And in addition to which, there have not been any killings, no gun violence in 4 years. This is not on CNN.
Right, thank you.
It should be. And we look every Sunday in the faces of not someone who's in prison, but a family who is impacted by someone who's in prison. Now, one of the things I think we have to figure out is what we had to figure out about HIV and AIDS. There is a shaming that goes along with creating unwelcoming communities so that some people won't acknowledge that they have family members who are imprisoned. And some won't acknowledge that they have been in prison. But if the truth be told, one way or another, we all are in prison. And we certainly are one person removed from somebody who has been. And that's the truth. And so what I would say is go back, figure out who your friends and allies can be, and collectively begin to put the data together that can show it's in people's best interest to address this issue. And that's the way in which you begin to find jobs for alternatives for people. However, the real issue is that the way in which workers and labor is treated in this country is also a manifestation of ethos of entitlement, which is what Milton Friedman said. And so this whole notion of any job is better than no job ain't necessarily true. So my point is we also have to be creative enough to rethink through what it means to create cooperatives, what it means to create small businesses and entrepreneurs where people can become self-sustaining as a part of how we see stewardship in ministry.
I think we have time for one more question, if it can be really brief.
Okay. It's going to be really brief. When we look at the issue of mass incarceration, we know it disproportionately affects African Americans. But when we look across the room here today, we don't see the same representation of the black church. And so when we're talking about the incarnational relationships, and it's not that the black church is not having these discussions, but what I think is the travesty is that we're all having our own discussions in silos instead of having an incarnational discussion together, because that is the true path for the unified church, I believe, to bring forth a unified Christian voice to the solution to this problem. So if you could talk about that in context of the incarnational relationships, I'd appreciate it.
Well, my short answer is that I think we need to be more intentional. There is something about economic privilege that would allow many of the people in this room to get on planes and come here. And that disparity in and of itself is a predictor of the complexion that is a reflection of this moment. Okay? I think, though, that the intentionality behind people making commitments on behalf of congregations to then engage in relationship building is an important one, but one that we have to do at the local level, that we have to commit to doing, and it can't be the way we did it before, which is, I'm going to come to save you, and you are the victim, and I am going to participate with you as long as I don't have to change. Because much of the work that has to be done, if the truth is told, Bill has already said where it needs to be done. And it does not preclude engagement with one another, but it does require intentional, strategic engagement that is not superficial, that honors the realities. Right now, we as an organization are working on what it means to speak of pastoral excellence and sustainability of one's self-care when you are clergy over a hurting congregation in ways that you can't even imagine. The choices that you have to make in terms of where you spend your time is very different than the choices of someone who has a different reality in terms of the congregation that they serve. So I don't want to prejudge why people are not in this room, because I understand that some of the people who are not in this room are somewhere else where they need to be, because of the very nature of what has happened as a result of white supremacy, racism, and white privilege in this nation.
If I could say one thing real quick. Last July, there are a group of, we took 5 representatives from 5 different conferences of United Methodists, and we did a training inside a prison in Chillicothe, Ohio. And the Brothers in Blue basically led the training. It was probably one of the most powerful, and most of our teams were predominantly white, because we are a 95% white church. The power of that training, it's hard for folks who were there to articulate it in words. And I think for me, one of the things that reinforced was that it's so difficult to talk about mass incarceration in a 5-star hotel, wearing a suit, and the thing that we're worried about is being overwhelmed by too many workshops and the temperature. If you want to be overwhelmed, try being a single mom of 4, recovering from addiction, unable to get a job, unable to find a decent place to live, and you've got to deal with all the other things of raising 4 kids. That's overwhelming. We just have a lot of workshops. So but when we begin to hear those voices, the thing that at least I walked away from was how inadequate we are structurally set up as a church to really effectively deal with issues of race. So we've got to, as we enter in, I don't think it's a one or the other. I think we've done that long enough, and it's been entirely ineffective. But as we enter incarnationally into relationships, and I'm speaking as a white Southern male, why the hell is a white Southern straight male the director of civil rights for the United Methodist Church? I mean, yeah, I know. Yeah, I know. Oh, I saw it. I feel it too. We've got a lot of deconstructing to do. We've got to deconstruct the ways in which we are structured as a church, which intentionally marginalize people, which force people to assimilate to a white-dominated culture in terms of how we ordain folks, of how folks get into these kinds of positions. We've got to do completely different ways of education. Our seminaries are run by white people, and we educate in Anglo-European ways. We've got to do a completely different system of how we've got a break. We've got to do a completely different system of education and leadership development. And we'll do that this week.